Hello, and welcome to this special lecture on gasoline prices. I wanted to address a question and comment that I've seen in the class blog posts fairly frequently, something along the lines of gasoline is a need, therefore we will pay pretty much anything that gasoline companies ask for. And there are some errors with that line of reasoning that I wanted to clear up. So without further ado, allow me to share my screen. And we'll get going. So, why are you still going to gas your car even with record prices? Well, is it a matter of need? Depends on what we mean by need. The word need implies an all or nothing approach. To say gasoline is a need implies that you're going to buy gasoline no matter what. Recall one of our pillars of economic reasoning is economic thinking is marginal thinking. We're not asking the question whether or not we're going to buy gasoline or not. It's how much gasoline are we going to buy? How much gasoline at the given price are we going to buy? We're making choices, and all choices involves trade-offs. What are the viable substitutes? What are our current situation? These are not issues of needs, but issues of the situation we find ourselves in. So, for example, consider this famous paradox, the water diamond paradox. Water is a need. We need water to survive. And yet water is fairly cheap. In most cases, it's free. You can pay a little bit more if you want, say, bottled water. You know, $1.50, $2. You could spend even more money, get the super filtered bottled water that comes from the glaciers of North Africa or wherever it is that they say comes from. I know North Africa doesn't have glaciers. I just said that. But there's still, no matter how much you pay for water, it's still cheaper than diamonds. Because diamonds are not a need. Best case scenario, they're useful, but they're not a need. So why do people pay so much for diamonds and not for water? Well, the reality is it depends on the situation that they're in. We're talking about the marginal unit of water and the marginal unit for diamonds. In much of the world, especially in the developed Western part of the world, the marginal unit of water is not worth a whole lot because we have lots of water. Anybody watching this right now can pretty much go to their sink, turn a knob, and have fresh water coming out, or hot water for that matter. It'll be clean, it'll be drinkable, no problems. We don't quite have the same for diamonds. Diamonds are fairly rare. Even there are cartels of diamonds that keep certain supply off the market, but even then, they're relatively more scarce than water is. So on the margin, people are willing to pay more for diamonds because the marginal use for a diamond is higher than the marginal use for water. If instead you find yourself wandering in the desert, you're dying of thirst. Now the marginal value of that water is going to be significantly higher. You'd be willing, if you had the money, you'd be willing to pay a lot more for water than you would for diamonds. The marginal use of that water is significantly higher. So the question for gasoline is something similar. Gasoline consumption is a choice. How much will we consume given a certain price? That's going to depend on its marginal uses. The use of that one more unit of gasoline. Let's have a quick review of the demand curve. This goes back to chapter 3 in our textbook. Demand curves are downward sloping. At higher prices, you consume less of a good. At lower prices, you tend to consume more. What this then implies is when the price is relatively high, as it is to the far left of the diagram, then it's going to be used for higher valued uses, whatever good it is. Water, drinking water for the preservation of life is a higher valued use. You're willing to pay a lot more for it. Meanwhile, the marginal units down here to the far right, these are lower valued uses. Those would be like using your water to water a garden or wash your car, things like that. If the price of water is relatively high, you're going to not use it to, say, wash your car, water your lawn, whatever. We use it more for cleanliness, for hygiene, for drinking, things like that. If the price of water were to fall, then you start to use it more for the lower valued uses. The same thing goes for gasoline. Gasoline, there are higher valued marginal uses, such as driving to work, and there are lower marginal value uses, such as idling the car. When the price is relatively high, you're going to use the gasoline mostly for driving for work, not so much idling the car. If the price of gasoline were to fall, you'd still use some for driving to work, but now the marginal price of the marginal unit is falling. So now you're willing to use it for more and more lower valued uses, such as idling the car. Even when the demand curve for a good is relatively inelastic, meaning the quantity demanded does not change significantly with a change in price, the same concept still applies. The marginal units at a higher price are going to be used for higher marginal valued uses, such as driving to work. And you still might use some for idling the car or the less valued uses, but not quite as much. Here in central New York, where I currently live, it's very cold. And often you need to idle the car in order to brush snow off, just to break up some of the ice and snow that has accumulated through the heat of the car. So if prices climb, I'm still going to idle, but maybe instead of idling for like 20 minutes, I'm going to just idle a little bit longer or a little less, get my car and go, see what we can do. This is a relatively inelastic demand curve. The reality is gasoline is probably not relatively inelastic, but has some phases. For the very high marginal use, very high marginal value uses like driving to work, you're probably willing to spend a lot of money on gasoline for those gallons that you would use getting to work. And there's going to be some uses which they're still going to be fairly high marginal value, but it drops off rapidly, such as idling the car, in the example I just gave. Then there's going to be a lot of uses for the car that you're simply just not going to do because the value is so low and it gets very, very flat, such as using the car as a stereo, or I don't know, maybe going off-roading for fun. Those sort of things, fairly low marginal value. So they're going to be the ones that are chopped off as the prices rise. So the key lesson here is the activities that fall on the left side of the graph, such as the high marginal value use of the product, such as driving to work, they're going to be done at the higher prices. The fact that these high marginal values exist does not imply that one will pay whatever price that companies ask, or that the law of demand gets thrown out the window. No. What the law of demand states is quantity demanded falls as price rises. And what that implies is lower valued uses are the ones that are no longer done as prices rise. So even as gasoline prices rise here in New York, they've gone up about 50 cents over the last 48 hours. Probably going to go up a little bit higher. Still going to gas my car and go to work. That's how I get my primary source of income. But I'm not going to be using it for joy rides or things like that. Personally, I've already canceled the trip to Niagara Falls that I was going to do, but now has gotten considerably more expensive. The marginal value of that trip has fallen relative to the costs. So oil companies, gasoline companies cannot ask for any price. They cannot ask a price higher than the marginal value, certain things, because people will ration, they will economize, as we say. They will make choices. Likewise, there are substitutes for gasoline. This relatively steep curve here indicates that there are, an assumption here is that there are a few substitutes for gasoline along these margins, say driving to work. That may or may not be the case, because there are substitutes out there. It just depends on how viable they are. Things like walking, things like public transportation or taxi cabs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All those things will factor to how steep the curves are and thus how willing people are to pay higher prices. So that is the end of this special lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. If there are any other questions, you know how to reach me.